Okay, will David record? Okay, hi. My name is Jeff Isaac. I teach political science at Indiana University in Bloomington, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this event. You may be wondering, who am I and why I'm here? If you're a regular attendee at these Tocqueville lecture series events, you know that they're organized by my colleague and my friend and my neighbor, Aurelian Craiutu, who organized this event. And unfortunately, as some of you may know, his father in Romania passed away this week. And so Aurelian, while he's hovering around, as he always does, has asked me to moderate this event, which I'm really happy to do. So on behalf of him and on behalf of the staff of the workshop and the department and everyone involved in setting this event up, I'd like to welcome you. And I'm very, very excited to welcome you here for this event. Which is a roundtable on our colleague Huss Banai's Hidden Liberalism, Burdened Vision of Progress in Modern Iran, which just came out. And Huss will speak first, and then Rahul Sagar, and then Lubna Elamin, and I will just briefly tell you about each of them before we get started. Then we could just move through. There'll be a discussion among them that I will moderate, hopefully by doing as little as possible. And then at some point, I, as the man with the gavel, will throw it open for questions and comments. And then we'll have a discussion, a broader discussion. We have 90 minutes. So Huss Banai is an assistant professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies here at Indiana University, where he's also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Political Science and Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. His research interests are at the intersection of political thought and international relations, with a special focus on topics in democratic theory, non-Western political thought, diplomatic history and theory, US-Iran relations, and Iran's political development. So he has a special focus on like 11 different things. He's what Foucault called a general intellectual. He is currently at work on a book project on the relationship between enmity and liberal legitimacy in democratic politics, and he is the author of this relatively new book that we're talking about, Hidden Liberalism, Burdened Visions of Progress in Modern Iran. Rahul Sagar is Global Network Associate Professor of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi, who just moved to Shanghai, right?
And NYU Shanghai, I guess I should say now.
Okay. NYU Shanghai. His forthcoming book, The Progressive Maharaja, Sir Madhava Rao's Hints on the Art and Science of Government, brings to light the first Indian treatise on liberal statecraft. When was it published, by the way?
Forthcoming this summer.
No, the first treatise, not your book.
Oh, the treatise was 1881.
Okay, thanks. He is presently working on a book entitled Decent Regimes, which traces the liberal character of the regime in Singapore. We are certainly always welcoming all efforts to promote decency in this world. Lubna Elamin is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University. Her first book, Classical Confucian Political Thought, A New Interpretation, was published in 2015 by Princeton University Press. I was actually very happy to commission a review of that book in Perspectives when I edited it. She's currently working on a second book, tentatively titled Beyond Freedom and Slavery, Status and Membership in the Ancient Confucian Political Community. Some of you may know Lubna was a student here for a couple of years, quite a few years ago, not that many. And I just want to say she was one of the very best students that I've ever had. And I loved having her in my seminars. And I am so thrilled by her academic and professional and personal success, and happy to welcome her back here as a colleague, as an expert, and as a discussant, a book author who's discussing another colleague's book. So this is wonderful. Welcome to you all. Hi, Lubna. It's nice to see you.
You're always very generous, Jeff.
I try. So anyway, the way that this will proceed is Huss will begin. He'll speak for around 10 to 15 minutes about his book. Then Lubna and Rahul will each offer around 10 minutes of comments. and there'll be a short response by Huss. I will say as little as possible, and hopefully this will just proceed very smoothly, and then we'll throw it open to the audience for questions and comments and have a discussion of this really interesting book and this important topic. Huss Banai.
Thank you, Jeff. Everyone can hear me. First, let me thank you for chairing this panel, and especially thank my friend and colleague, Aurelian Kraichu, for inviting me to present at the lecture, Tocqueville lecture series, and thank the Austrian workshop for hosting it as well. David and Alison Sturgeon for arranging all the pre-talk logistics, and also thank the participants on this roundtable, my friends and colleagues, Lubna and Rahul. Rahul, is midnight where you are. I'm especially grateful that you've given all the travel that you've been doing recently, that you've taken the time to read the book and to agree to participate on this roundtable. I'm grateful for you for being here. And Lubna, as someone whose work very much intersects with some of the themes in the book, and in this particular patch of political theory, I've learned so much from your work, and I very much look forward to learning more and to hear your comments about the book as well. And thank to the rest of you for being here, for those of you who are in Indiana, for throwing away a perfectly fine Friday afternoon and subjecting yourself to political theory in different keys. Let me begin by briefly summarizing. I thought the best way to get into this discussion is to talk about the major themes and arguments of the book. I think the book attempts to do three main things, and it's funny, after you publish a book and you start rereading some of these passages, and are no longer cringing, but are thinking about things that you could have developed better, or thoughts that were in your heads, but are now much more clearly need to be elaborated. It's been a weird experience that way for me, and so now that I look at the book, I see it as broadly doing three things, and there may be more that Rahul and Lubna and the rest of you have seen, or maybe it's not doing those three things that well at all either. The first thing that I wanted to accomplish in this book is to advance a claim, a very general claim against political theories, what I call political theories' entrenched visibility bias toward non-Western forms of liberalism. It's remarkable. It was one of the first, if you will, intellectual itches that I first started scratching that really started this book going for me, was how little was written on non-Western liberalisms. It's a remarkable thing. It's oftentimes, when you're looking at works on non-Western political development or political thought, it's oftentimes a projection of Western templates of Western ideologies, be it liberalism, socialism, Marxism, nationalism, different forms of secularism, that are juxtaposed or superimposed, rather, onto non-Western domains of intellectual activity. So one of the first things I wanted to do is to kind of flag this and advance a claim against it, and to sort of say this exists. There is a entrenched visibility bias, and especially glaringly so within liberal political theory itself. As much as liberal political thought has developed in the Western Academy over the course of the last half century or so, it's done so with absolute confidence that what it is considering is universally valid across different spaces, and it's just a matter of it having been developed or received or incorporated, internalized, institutionalized by different regimes. The second, I'll come back to and elaborate on these a little bit more. The second thing that the book is attempting to do is to develop and offer an account of what I call the thought practice of hidden liberalism in modern Iran's political development. So after kind of becoming aware of this oversight within political theory, this visibility bias, I turned to a case that I know well. And in fact, it was a case that really clued me into this to begin with, as a result of my work on my dissertation, but also always working on Iran's political development here and there. And in the book, I develop an account of an alternative mode of thought, of liberal thought, that I glean being very present, influential, consequential, and nevertheless hidden and invisible in the course of Iran's political development. And the book develops that over the course of 2 or 3 chapters in the book. This what I call hidden liberals, and I'll say more about that in just a second. And then the last thing, I think the broad thing that the book is maybe somewhat pretentiously is attempting to do, and this is a very much still a work in gestation, but I allude and gesture to it in the concluding chapter of the book, is present an alternative hybrid methodological example of how those of us interested in carrying out research on intellectual developments or on what's called history of ideas in burdened contexts, non-Western as well as Western. There could be burdened contexts where ideas are always under the shadow and of a particular framework, be it imperial framework in the case of post and semi-colonial societies, or other, contexts, gendered contexts, for instance, or other burdened forms of context. So the book tries to kind of, I think, offer an alternative hybrid methodological example of how we might go about studying those burdened ideologies. What does the burden of a particular context do to both the reception, the organic iteration and reiteration of ideas that accord well to a particular political context? And importantly here, I'd be interested in comments on this, I've made special care to distinguish this particular example from what's often now labeled as comparative political theory within Western academy today. And so the book kind of concludes with that general opening on a methodological question as well. Let me go back briefly to this point, the first claim on visibility bias. The argument here is a familiar one. It's one that perhaps has become more, people in the West have become more conscious of it as a result of American Western foreign policy over the course of the last 20 years or so. This notion that liberal democracy especially has a universal form, and the task is really to pick out the impediments to its realizations, right? The kind of Fukuyama end of history argument is the way in which this is manifested itself. Within political theory, I think the picture is far more complex and multi-layered than that. I talk about this entrenched visibility bias within political theory, and especially liberal political theory, that's premised primarily on what Bill Galston, the liberal political theorist, talks about, the concept of expressive liberties. The way you identify liberal practices and liberal thought, the way you identify liberals, is by looking at the exercise of their expressive capacities, how they let themselves be known in public. Well, what happens when a public context in which liberals exist, thank you, Jeff, is hostile to that, or there has to be a prudent or judicious way of manifesting or expressing your liberalism in those contexts. to my knowledge, Western political theory has very little to say about that. It just sees it as a, as an expression of the existence of predominantly anti-liberal ideologies, right? The reason why liberalism cannot advance or is not identifiable to us the way we identified in liberal constitutional settings is because anti-liberal ideologies are more powerful. And I think this is a mistaken view. It's one that is, I think, a kind of a political theory manifestation of a kind of Fukuyama type conception. I think liberal perspectives and liberal views, and I show this through the case of Iran, what's remarkable about them, they are ever present. They are just ever present and consequential in a way that is oftentimes not familiar to their Western counterparts. And that really interested me toward developing this concept of hidden liberalism, which I call the judicial and circumspect thought practice of liberalism in a manner that it would be unfamiliar to its would-be opponents, right? In the case of Iran, in chapters 2 and 3 of the book, I go about demonstrating what the content of this hidden liberal ideology has been. And here I borrow from the work of Alan Ryan in schematizing liberalism in the Iranian context as not representing the kind of the same substantive ideals that we identify in Western contexts, or not just those substantive ideals, individualism, equality, reciprocity, but rather in the form of 3 key antipathies and 3 prescriptions. The antipathies being anti-traditionalism, the liberal project as something that is trying to wage battle against traditionalist perspectives by introducing progressive ideas and domesticating and contextually articulating what progressive ideas mean in the case of Iran. The second antipathy, that of anti-absolutism, which is more universal. Thank you. And the third antipathy, anti-imperialism. Far from non-Western liberals being an ally or part of the collaborative network of imperial forces in semi and post-colonial societies, I found in the case of Iran especially, that they articulate a particular form of anti-imperialism that is very careful to not let go of crucial constitutional rights-based ideals at the heart of liberalism. In fact, their marginalization in the second half of the 20th century in Iran is owed to the fact that they are not willing to revolt and throw the whole constitutional project out the door, but rather elaborate them in ways that would serve the interests of different constituencies in Iran, but also of Iran as a nation state as well. In terms of the prescriptions are a response to those antipathies. The liberal project really boils down for me in the course of Iran's last 100 years of political development to a version of liberal nationalism or civic nationalism, constructing a liberal narrative of what it means to be a sovereign, independent state through appeals to international law and ideals in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, there's common themes here through many post-colonial societies. The second prescription is that of constitutionalism, to renew the constitutional project and wage it against their opponents, be they absolutist royals in the form of the Pahlavi regime, of ethnic nationalists, nativists, Marxist-Leninist political movements, which were very powerful in the second half of the 20th century in many, again, burdened contexts such as Iran, and especially so against religious and Islamic movements in the case of Iran after the Iranian Revolution. The constitutional project, the notion that the basis of political legitimacy should rest on a set of constitutional rights and not on the arbitrary or metaphysical sources of authority is central to the liberals. And lastly, the last prescription is that of pluralism. And this is a project that really in the latter half of the 20th century gets going in Iran, and its chief exponents have really been taken by the works of Western thinkers like Isaiah Berlin to articulate and distinguish between moral pluralism, the notion that the ends of the good life or ends that individuals pursue in society are many and not singular, away from the mere fact of pluralism as something that, societies are diverse and have many different viewpoints represented, etc. And pluralism has become an important project in spurring reformist movements against Islamic visions of constitutionalism. I critiqued and present those views in the course of chapter 4 of the book, and has been successful in opening a modest space for considerations of a genuinely Iranian form of liberalism. So in the book, to conclude, I don't present a singular definition or a history of liberal thought in Iran, but rather show the obstacles in the way of the emergence of a publicly avowed form of liberalism, and why we still can learn a great deal from that and how it shapes politics in contemporary Iran. There you go, Jeff. 30 seconds over.
No, it was right. I played with you. Thank you so much. Lubna, would you like to go next, or Rahul? I don't know. We didn't discuss this.
Sure. Should I go?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say how happy I am to be back at Indiana. I'm not quite the real thing, but I'm happy to see familiar faces. It's been so long. And I just want to also start by saying how much I enjoyed reading Huss Banai's book. I found the quest for thinking about the embodiments of liberalism in non-Western context, or as Banai puts it, in semi-colonial context, to be quite refreshing. And I thought the book blends sensitivity to liberalism as an intellectual tradition and to the particularities of non-Western contexts, particularly in this case, Iran. So this kind of, quite sensitive attention to what liberalism is as a tradition, and kind of an interest in it, and this really also interest in Iran is really nice to see them together. So what I want to do is raise a few questions, and they're mostly going to be about the comparative aspects of the project. So my questions are going to be sort of like taking this framework that Huss offers for us about the visibility bias, about burdened societies. Does it apply elsewhere? Why? How? So I want to start by the visibility bias, which Huss just started with also his comments. So I found this claim quite thought-provoking, and I hadn't thought of it, to be honest. So, and I thought it was sort of persuasive that liberalism suffers from a visibility bias. And so now the question that arose for me, and it's something you just touched on in your introduction, Huss, is how much this is a bias just against non-Western context, or does it include any form of liberalism in a non-liberal or despotic context, right? Because you have both of those working in the book. So I'm thinking here of liberalism as it developed, say, in communist Eastern Europe. Jeff would know, and Aurelian would know much more about this than me. But so the question there is that, is there visibility bias against liberalism as developed in these kinds of societies under specific kinds of rule? And the truth is that these societies have been less studied, much less studied than Western Europe has, right? So it's not just non-Western context, it's also Eastern Europe too. And in fact, I think, as you say that in the book, where you say that mostly the study of liberalism is limited to English, French, American contexts, right? So is it that Eastern Europe has been studied less because of the visibility bias? Is that what's doing the work? Or are there other reasons? And part of what I'm thinking here is that, perhaps there's also this interest among theorists in sort of a grand theory, as opposed to sort of the kind of granular and contextual history that you offer here. And maybe that's also related to the visibility bias or not, but sort of there's more interest in the canonical kind of thinkers, right? And so, so would you say that the visibility bias explains the lack of attention to these other societies as well? Now, one clear difference between Eastern Europe and non-Western cases like Iran, and it's something you also point to in the book, is obviously the colonial legacy, right? Which figures prominently in your analysis. And it's central to your, I think, perceptive description of liberalism as burdened in semi-colonial settings. But then there's a burden and there's a burden, and you talk about two kinds of burden. So there's a burden of despotism or any kind of non-liberal rule, and then there's a burden of colonial imperial legacy. And the thing is, they don't always go together, right? So take Belarus today, it's, you can say liberalism there is burdened. Obviously, it's burdened differently from the kind of non-Western post-colonial contexts. Or you can take, maybe India would be a good case here to think about a context where you have the burden of the colonial legacy, but you don't have the burden of despotism, right? And so these two burdens don't necessarily come together. And in some sense, I kind of want to say that what you're talking about is a double burden, not just a burdened society. Iran is doubly burdened in a way. And again, it might be useful to sort of distinguish those two kinds of burdens and which one is doing the work, or maybe it's what you're interested in is intersection. The other question I had is about your claim that there's no properly liberal sort of, I'm quoting you, formalized intellectual program or political agenda in Iran. There hasn't been. So I found this surprising, and I was wondering why I found this surprising, and I think it's because the context I know better, so whether that would be in the Arab world or East Asia, I wouldn't have said this. Now, maybe I'm wrong about this, but sounds good. And so I think I would have thought that these countries definitely have liberal movements, especially in the 20th century, and so I would have expected Iran to be the same. But then I wondered whether what's doing the work here is that you don't want to call liberalism, so you're saying liberalism is usually used in Iran as a qualifier for centrist, moderate, or reformist positions with non-liberal ideologies, and that's not really liberalism proper. But maybe it's almost like you're catching liberalism somehow. So, I mean, what's a properly liberal movement? What would count as a good example of what, And so I'm thinking here, like, just take the United States. What's a liberal political party or political movement? I mean, they're all liberal something else is going on, right? So potentially what you're attributing to Iran is true everywhere. Now, you might say that we have a liberal programmatic tradition of thought in Iran, in the US, in academia, maybe. I mean, people will say like Rawls, John Rawls, Rawlsians, whatever. But I'm not sure that that's true, and it would potentially stand in contradiction with your account of liberalism as being somehow, you have this very nice discussion of how liberalism is hard to define and different people think of it differently and all of that. So you're sort of expecting to find something in Iran that perhaps is actually not found even other places. So I just want to push on that point of sort of the programmatic aspect, like what do you want it to be for it to be liberal? And so the final question I have here, and this is just an issue I have generally with accounts of liberalism, so it doesn't just pertain to your analysis, but I worry, and this is something I wrote about in a Perspectives article that Jeff kindly shepherded when he was editor, is the conflation between liberalism and sort of, I think, institutional features of the modern state. And I think a good example here is the rule of law. So if someone asks that they want a rule of law, is that a liberal claim? It seems to me that it just arises from the mere feature of having a modern state that there's going to be calls for the rule of law, from the state, from citizens, from whatever. It just follows from from the way it's structured. Now, they might be well-intentioned, bad-intentioned, like they might be abused, but the claim is there. Do we count that as a liberal claim? I think this somehow, that gets counted as a liberal claim, but I'm not sure. Now you can get into the business of like what's intended behind it. Is it intrinsic respect for the rule of law or instrumental? But then you might open a whole kind of forums about whether liberals agree, whether it has to be intrinsic for it to be liberal. Anyhow, what I'm pointing to is that I think there's certain values that sort of arise from certain realities on the ground that sort of inevitably arise. And I'm not sure, maybe we should call them liberal, maybe not. But they're not sort of, I'm not sure that the way it's framed as being liberal versus non-liberal is always the best way to capture it. And so my point is that there's a way in which non-Western societies share with Western societies material and political realities centered on the fact of the modern state system. Now, this modern state system arose in close relation with colonialism, and that's the predicament that you very sensitively capture in the book. But then the critique here cannot just be at the level of ideology, right? It's not just these values and what they are and who, but also what is making these values seem pressing or not. So there's a materiality that needs to be also thought about. Now, be that as it may, I think what I really appreciate about your book is the way in which you really start sort of helping us understand political thought in non-Western societies beyond the all too easy binary between the West and the rest. And so this kind of this capturing of the Iranian world of thought that is complex, fraught, and escaping the usual stereotypes is very refreshing and very thoughtful. My small questions notwithstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Lubna. Rahul?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Aurelian, for having me here. And it's an honor to be with Huss and Lubna. Huss, thank you for an absolutely wonderful book. This is one of those books for me in particular, at least speaking for myself. You go through many years, many decades saying someone really should write a book about the fact that people are more liberal than they appear or than they're given credit for. And then lo and behold, you've written the book. So thank you for a very, very important book. I think it's timely, it's important, it's well written, it's accessible. It conceptualizes and gives terms for things that I think those of us that travel and look around and visit places and think about, try and empathize can see. So it's a very valuable contribution. And as you said, I see three sort of big points, and then I want to turn to my questions right after. But I think the first important, as the title itself says, the first important contribution is that it draws attention to hidden liberal, what you call thought practices, and it directs the eye to something very important that's highly underappreciated. Second, it elaborates those thought practices in the Iranian context. I'm not an expert on Iran, and I learned a lot reading it. I know certain figures like Afghani, but I learned a lot. And my questions won't be so much about that as they will be about the first and the third aspect of the book, which is how much you encourage us as readers and as thinkers to think about substance rather than form. The Western obsession, or the Western liberal obsession, always feels slightly awkward saying Western, but broadly, this approach that tends to focus on liberal institutions and doesn't think about liberal practices. So I want to focus.
You.
Oh,
can you say that again? Sorry. Now we
can you hear me now? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
This is VPN. I have a semi-liberal VPN that I'm having to use from China. So apologies. So I was summarizing these 3 points. The first was that Huss goes out to hidden practices. Second, that it elaborates the Iranian case, which is a very nice illustration. And third, that it draws our attention to substance rather than form. It takes us away from thinking just about institutional things to thinking about how people act and behave and think in practice. All right. So having sort of noted those three broad features of the book and appreciated them, I had two, let me say, constructive questions, and then one pessimistic worry, which I'll turn to later. So first, the two questions. One question is whether you think that whether it's possible to systematize this study of hidden liberalism. And I wanted to suggest, or at least see what you think about the possibility of empirical investigation. I don't just mean by that looking at texts and looking at debates, but looking at how liberalism actually cashes out in daily life. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. There's something, given that this is recorded, there's certain examples I can't quite talk about, but let me give you two. In Abu Dhabi, the way someone wears an abaya, the covering, tells you a lot about how liberal they are and how liberal they might be aspiring to be, about their family background. The person they choose to possibly date, interracial, interethnic dating has increased rapidly in recent years in a place like Abu Dhabi as the country liberalizes and becomes more cosmopolitan. So if you were to look at the law would look draconian in all sorts of ways. The law would say women are encouraged to dress in a certain way that represents the national identity. But of course, in practice, how someone dresses can send all sorts of signals with very minor, subtle changes one way or another. Now, that's something that's very difficult to measure, but there's other things like, as I was suggesting, interracial marriages or interethnic marriages or cohabitation. These are things that it is possible to study and compare and evaluate. The second example I was going to give is one about something as simple as transgender rights, for instance. So if someone was to compare the US and Singapore, they would point to all the liberal institutional protections that someone has if they are from the LGBT community. And then they would turn to a place like Singapore and say, the absence of those LGBT protections in the law suggests that Singapore is illiberal and the US is liberal. Well, if you turn that story around and you try and look at violence against people from those communities, you'll find that in Singapore, there's practically zero violence of any kind against someone that happens to come from that community. And that contrasts rather poorly with violence against members in the LGBT community, but particularly transgender individuals in the United States. And so that's an example for me of where the empirical reality is incredibly different, actually, when one tries to compare how liberalism actually looks on the ground. You get rights, but you don't really enjoy them as much in some places. And in others, you don't have officially the rights or formally the rights, but you enjoy them a lot more. So that was just one thought about whether we can actually compare liberalism in this more substantive way. The second is, thanks. The second is a question that builds a little bit on Lubna. I think Lubna's comment, Lubna made a very nice point about this double burden in the Iranian context. And I wonder if there's a triple burden, sorry, Lubna, to pile on, which is whether liberalism has a particularly hard time, not just in places that are understudied or places that have gone through the imperial colonial experience, but also in the broadly speaking in the Islamic world, where liberalism is not just in contest with, say, the authority in power, not just in contest with an identification with the West or West toxification, but it's also in tension with a religion or religious set of practices that have a very strong communitarian and disciplinarian side. There's certain practices, certain things, whether it's diet, whether it's marriage, whether it's community. It's a demanding religion in that sense, or set of religious practices. And that's less so the case. There's more room for maneuver in some other post-colonial context. So I wonder if the Iranian context is particularly challenging, or broadly speaking, the Islamic world faces a particularly hidden, or produces a particularly hidden form of liberalism, even more so than elsewhere. Okay, so those two questions. One was, can we systematize or think in more concrete ways about the study of hidden liberalism? And secondly, is hidden liberalism particularly acute in the broader Islamic world. And then let me end with, and I apologize in advance for ending on a pessimistic downbeat note. And nothing to do with the book. The book was wonderful. It's about what we can do with the book. So here's my concern, and it's exactly about the visibility bias that Lubna drew attention to. I think that is the single most important conceptual contribution of the book, and it's something that deserves to be studied very widely. Whenever you discuss the visibility bias, you use the term, I saw it a couple of times, use the phrase unwitting. And I wonder, is it unwitting? Can you help people see what they wish not to see? And there are two ways in which, over my life, I've seen people not wish to see. One is very familiar to us, it's interest. Those that are powerful have an interest in not seeing those that are less powerful for who they really are. The Islamic world's been particularly victim of that gaze, the self-interested gaze. But there's a second, and that's the one that I think you talk about in the book as well, Edward Said's Orientalism. There's a second gaze, and that's the cultural one. And I wonder, we can do as much as we can do to try and make the West see liberalism in other places. But if they have a very strong, not only an interest, but a very strong belief in their hierarchical superiority, if they have a belief that only they are truly liberal, only they have found the way to liberalism, and everybody else is merely a student, then telling them about the visibility bias and showing them the existence of hidden liberalism elsewhere is something that's likely to fall on deaf ears. Interest and culture make it incredibly difficult to think that the West is interested in hidden liberalism. And so you've written a fantastic book. I'm not sure, and Lubna, I apologize for the binary. I'm not sure this is a book for the West. This is a book for us, the rest. Thanks.
Thank you, Rahul. Huss is going to briefly respond, and then we'll throw it open. I just want to make one comment. I said I would say very little, and this is not, I'm not going to speak for very long, but I would just note, I don't think I heard in any of the discussions thus far an acknowledgement of the fact that there currently is a theocratic regime in Iran. I'm not criticizing anyone for not mentioning it, but I wonder how that figures and if that has anything to do with anything you're going to say. Huss, and now I'm done. Huss.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for that reminder, actually, because I think that is an important puzzle toward which the book is working in a way without explicitly taking it on. There have been so many studies of the Islamic Revolution, why it happened, the different examinations of different factions within it, etc. And I find all of those almost kind of missing the big point, which was, how is it that in the course of the 20th century, Iran experiences 5 different types of regime. Theocracy comes later after 79, but you have a kind of a despotic Qajar dynasty in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You have a period of constitutional opening, the Constitutional Revolution, that is immediately ended through the coming to power of the first Pahlavi autocrat, Reza Khan, who's a state builder, and you get a period of state building. Then he goes into exile after the Second World War, and you have this period of parliamentary opening with Mohammad Mossadegh, perhaps the most famous Iranian, who nationalizes Iran's oil resources. And today, in fact, is the anniversary of the nationalization of oil in Iran. And Mossadegh obviously gets overthrown through a CIA and MI6 sponsored coup. And then Pahlavi II comes in, and then after that, you have the Islamic Republic and the revolution that takes place. And throughout these developments, you have this kind of liberal thought practice, being shaped and reshaped and undone by these different contexts. And hopefully the book has kind of brought that about. But Jeff, you're absolutely right that the puzzle of the Islamic Republic, the puzzle of theocracy, how is it that we end up here? I think goes back to this question of the double or triple burden of on semi-colonial context, which I'll get to here. I think the first, I'm grateful for these points to both of you, Lubna and Rahul, for your careful reading, for these wonderful questions, and reframing of some of the points that I have tried to make in the book. And let me take Lubna's first point and Rahul's first point together, this question of systematizing hidden liberal practices, which Lubna asked about in the context of Western, but non-post-colonial contexts, such as Eastern Europe, for instance, how we might think about it in those contexts, etc. I think the thing that I'm careful to do in the book is I am less interested in coming up with a formula for what it means to be a liberal, or a comprehensive view of liberalism, what we call comprehensive liberalism in political theory, and much more interested about political liberalism, or the liberal political space that is either created or not created, in which people can then have at it in terms of defining what their liberalism is, right? I am very careful not to assign any essence to liberalism. I find that anytime I see that in works of Western political thought, which is part of the byproduct of this visibility bias, by the way. We keep going banging our heads about what is the essence of liberalism, and that conversation always, comes down to that: your liberalism versus my liberalism. And I think, Alan Ryan poses this question that says, there's this embarrassing question hanging over modern liberalism and in Western political theory, right? We know who the liberals are. We know less about what they have in common. Right. So the essence of liberalism is something that can be battled over and over again. And I'm not interested in kind of bringing up a template. And so I do think that one can find burdened contexts within Western and non-Western societies. I happen to think that the non-Western semi and post-colonial societies are the most glaring space, and the one that I'm knowledgeable about right now in the case of Iran, that I can kind of open up that conversation. And I hope it kind of can be applied to other contexts, even in Western. I mean, in the last 4 years, during the Trump presidency, we've seen the different burden contexts in which liberals and non-liberals have tried to wage battle and bring attention to their particular perspective as a liberal, for how they see their vantage points. What led to this, eruption of right-wing chauvinism, nationalism, et cetera, who's complicit and why, et cetera. So the burden contexts can always be articulated, but my point is that the understanding the context in which liberalism operates is absolutely important in understanding what aspects of, liberal political projects are succeeding, failing, et cetera. And in the case of Iran, I think the double burden of responsibility here is very important. And I think, Rahul, to answer your second question in conjunction with Lubna's second question, I think I mentioned this in the book, that Iranian intellectuals have this double burden of responsibility. They not only have to register liberal claims against the state, and oftentimes arbitrary sources of authority, be they religious authorities or despotic monarchs, anti-liberal political movements, et cetera. But they also have to constantly account for the context in which the state has been disfigured and doesn't have the capacity to respond to those liberal claims, right? That's a terrible burden, but that's one thing that I think liberal imperialism's legacy, the standard of civilization, the kind of the realist intervention you have, Rahul, in the end, in terms of your pessimistic outlook, is so badly misunderstood, even in contemporary studies of empire and liberalism, right? Just what burden this has imposed on non-Western, formerly colonized societies, or societies on the periphery of Western geopolitical interests, is not terribly well understood, because it has not only politicized and radicalized movements that were otherwise part of the fabric of rich fabric of cultural life of a society, such as religious movements, right? I note in the book how early constitutional reformists in Iran are mostly clerics and people who are fascinated by the kind of Enlightenment, thank you, Jeff, strands in the West, but are so aware that they need to, as it were, contemplate this in terms of what it means for the course of development of their own countries. Well, religion completely becomes radicalized and a feebled and weak thing, and develops a nativist streak even in the second half of the 20th century in Iran. And these arguments about Westoxication and Westoxified, Iranian elites or Iranians who want to copy and just bring about a facsimile of Western forms, etc. Really, I think digress and distract away from what is really the issue that liberals ultimately want to solve, which is to make the state accountable, to realize a constitutional form of government. And this goes to your other point, Lubna, about rule of law versus other liberal elements. I'm careful, as one of the prescriptions that I identify with Iranian liberals, I don't think it's rule of law. And you find that, I think mistakenly, in my view, pop up in even Western accounts of the development of liberalism in Western societies, that the rule of law is central to the liberal project. That is not the case. You absolutely, beautifully put it. I think constitutionalism is. I think putting a notion of rights, rights-based constraints on the exercise of central authority is the liberal project, is part of a liberal project. And I identify that prescription specifically in the case of Iranian liberals in that specific context. And then the last thing I'll say in response to, I'm sorry, I'm losing my, in response to Lubna's point about the programmatic aspect of liberalism or hidden liberalism, or in Iran, whether this is something that's different from, thank you, Jeff, the Arab and East Asian context, because you can readily identify a more programmatic movement there. I could have written this book actually beginning with that programmatic and acknowledge and try to will it into being and say, look, I can identify a chain of liberals over the course of 100 years whose ideas build on each other roughly. And I started actually thinking about writing the book that way. Maybe I'll actually speak to the, the way Albert Hourani, I'm no Albert Hourani, but Albert Hourani in terms of, liberal thought in the, Arabic Thought in Liberal Age, his famous book, articulates. And then the more I looked into it, the more I found these, thinkers to be grappling with particular burdens of their own times, and not part of a coherent project.
Just my question was more that perhaps it's not programmatic even in in what's in the Arab world. There's no such thing as a programmatic liberalism. So that in that sense, what you're identifying is actually what is common, except we don't speak about this.
I see. I'm so sorry. I got it the other way around. Too defensive on my part, perhaps, but absolutely. I mean, I think that's so maybe it's a chance for me to elaborate on this. Is that it is? Thanks. That is an important thing to understand. Is that there is not a conscious program being built. That's part of the, again, a burden that is carried by liberals given those historical circumstances in post-imperial societies. And I think the question of empire is huge here. But more importantly, I think it also speaks to, and this is the other thing that needs to be studied, and Rahul, this goes to your last point, is the vehemence, the absolute, almost done, Jeff, the absolute, almost like zealous like fixation of anti-liberals against liberals in the second half of the 20th century, because so much is at stake in the project of state building and nationalism that these other cohorts would like to inject their own specific ideologies with. So liberals become, you know, the number one enemy. And to this day, to close it all with the Islamic Republic frame, the supreme leader of Iran is loath to, you know, he's above, you know, identifying specific faction and bringing himself down to the level of particular activists, etc. But if there's one ideology he's always railed against, is liberalism. Not, you know, Western arrogance, he'll say those things too. But the thing that always he's against, and he says the Islamic Republic is the antithesis of liberalism. Like, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for staying on time. And so we have some time for audience participation and broader discussion. I tend to moderate in a different way than Aurelian. Aurelian likes to take like 2 questions at a time. I hate that. I prefer it if people ask very sharp, direct questions and then they're answered. And then we move on to the next one so that there's actually a focus on a question. So if you would like to ask a question, you would like raise your hand, use that function on Zoom. I'll call on you. You could do this also so that it's more visible to me. So far, no one's hand is up.
How about those on the phone? Can they raise their hand or what should they do?
Oh, this is the man in the background. Yes. Okay, go on.
Thanks to all for excellent points there. I have one question for Huss, I think in general. Liberals in Eastern Europe, in order to become successful, have had to be eclectic. In other words, they had to borrow from different traditions. And I was wondering, and this is a question for all of you basically, whether, for example, an alliance between liberalism and nationalism is the way to think about how to make liberal ideas more visible and more poignant in non-liberal settings. So that's all I have to ask. Thank you to all.
I don't know if Rahul or Lubna want to go first since I just spoke, and then I could.
Rahul.
It's Huss's book. Huss, please.
Well, I was going to say the temptation is always there. I actually find that temptation to be very detrimental to the faith of liberalism, to take nationalism as a vehicle for bringing cohesion to a liberal program in a given country, because it necessarily gets bogged down into drawing up borders between insiders and outsiders, and gets fascinated with this, again, a burden that is superimposed on it, which is to kind of create liberal individuals, right? In the context of burdened societies, the temptation to force people to be free, right? To use another Berlinian phrase, of positive freedom, in other words, is so great that many liberals, very few liberals have passed without bringing shame to their movements. But I don't know what Rahul or Lubna think in other contexts.
Do you have thoughts on this? You don't have to.
I don't really know.
I'm sympathetic to Aurelian's view that you do get a lot of eclecticism. You get part of it is a result of the strategic points that Huss draws attention to, that you can't come out explicitly as a liberal, but also because the cultural and historical background often means that the sorts of people that are at the that are in the position to make these kinds of claims and critiques aren't coming from a doctrinaire position. They don't have a fully worked out ideology or philosophy. They're kind of feeling their way as they go through when we're talking about freedom movements or post-colonial movements or decolonization movements. So there's a lot of eclecticism, borrowing from different places and trying to get liberalism ahead step by step in disparate directions. So,
Huss, if I could just push you very briefly, and because I want to give some airtime to Aurelian's good question. So even in the case of Iran, wouldn't Iranian liberalism have to in part mobilize nationalism against the overthrow of Mossadegh? Maybe dangerous, but can you do without it? Lots of important things are dangerous.
Absolutely. I mean, Mossadegh is probably the first Iranian liberal nationalist, right? The tragedy of his example is that he was so intent on pleading Iran's case through international liberal institutions, right? To get Iran to be incorporated into the, community of liberal international society, that his overthrow is so tragic. And I think it's, in fact, followers of Mossadegh today are the ones who emphasize this point because they want to distinguish themselves from religious nationalists who they think betrayed Mossadegh, from royalists who, again, use nationalism to their advantage to bring the second Pahlavi's son back to power and justify his rules and reforms, etc. But also, more importantly, progressive socialist, and at that time, the Tudeh party, the communist bloc, that very much wanted Mossadegh to go away because they wanted Iran to be part of this, international socialist movement, and in fact be at the head of it. And Mossadegh carefully walked this line. I mean, he traveled to the United States and addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress. Most Americans don't know this, pleading his case, saying, I want to do business with the West. I would like our oil to be something that can help you and help you develop it. So you don't need to be scary. I'm not some, radical communist. And Time magazine put his picture on, and next to his face put the communist symbol, and said he's basically the avatar of the Tudeh and the communist left in the third world, and that ended it. And the communist faction in Iran won because Mossadegh went away, and they said, yes, absolutely, we would like to be the at the head of this movement. And no one else has been able to replicate his kind of civic liberal nationalist model since.
Thank you for that. Bill has his hand up, and then after the answer to Bill's question, Kwang Yu. Yes, Bill.
Why don't we reverse it? I have a smaller question.
Okay, Kwang Yu.
Okay, thank you to Professor Banai and to other scholars who come to give this wonderful talk. And I'm a PhD student here studying political theory with these 3 or 4 wonderful political theories at IU here. So my question, I read your book. This is a wonderful book. So I think it's also very related to my own research agenda, but we may talk about this later. So my question is that, I think modern liberalism in its original form was developed in the distinctive historical context of Europe, right? So there are many key factors contributing to its genesis. But I think one factor was very important. It's undoubtedly the Christian tradition, Christianity. So I think in recent critique of John Rawls' liberalism, Eric Nielsen, in his book The Theology of Liberalism, points out the interesting theological doctrine of Pelagianism that played an important role in the development of modern liberal writers. And also remember that the very idea of liberal toleration in John Locke's writings is largely built on a Protestant idea of a relationship between individual believers and God. So my point is that the very reason of why liberal ideas doesn't fare well in Iran, and as Professor Qajar points out, is especially facing challenge in Islamic world in general, might be the fact that Western liberalism does not really speak to the deep concerns of some non-Western cultural burden like Islamism. So I think this book engages this problem by discussing those Islamic writers, pluralist writers who are at the same time not salient Western liberals. So I want to point out this because you in your short presentation today, you did not talk about much about that. So I just want to remind you, maybe you want to add something here. Like my question would be, so what is the distinctive factor feature about the contribution made by this engagement between Iranian Islamism and liberalism? Like why those Islamic writers in Iran, even some of them quite open-minded in my eyes, are still particularly doubtful toward the liberalism as a doctrine. So
that's a very good question, Kwang Yu. You didn't let me get away with it, which is wonderful, because if I give I've given a version of this talk to Iranian studies audiences, and that is absolutely the central question they'd like to examine, and especially because chapters 3 and 4 of the book really take to task religious scholars and religious theorists of Islamic democracy, which I find to be working very much against the development of a programmatic liberal intellectual current in Iranian society by appropriating certain liberal ideas into religious thought, religious reformists like Abdul Karim Soroush, who became very famous in Western circles in the 90s and early 2000s as the kind of Martin Luther of Islam. Again, Western magazines love to kind of put these titles on organic intellectuals. And obviously none of that succeeded. I mean, the reformist movement in Islamic Republic is in utter shambles. And I point out and criticize in the book the reasons for that, which is a fundamental incoherence of those theories that wish to construct a synthetic a model of liberal democracy and religious government without acknowledging or being willing ultimately to grant full constitutional rights on the basis of the liberal principle of equal respect for persons, but rather on the basis of the divine principle of Islamic Sharia interpretation, which is something that can be interpreted by any cleric depending on the burdens of their contexts, right? I'm very careful. I don't want to kind of draw this hard distinction between Islam and liberalism. And I talk in the book at length about why I find that to be very unproductive. And for reasons that Rahul, in the examples that he mentioned with the abaya and Dubai, for instance, pointed out, it also defies empirically how people of different backgrounds, manifest liberalism in their personal lives or subscribe to liberal political ideas. But I think in that binary aside, setting that binary aside, and I find that binary to have been constructed, by the way, by religious intellectuals like Al-Afghani, lay intellectuals like Jalal al-Ahmad, who coined the term Westoxication, for instance, to have been especially useful for their political projects succeeding. The binaries we find between Western, non-Western, Islam, non-Islam, or secular political movements is really the handiwork of radicalized, I shouldn't say radicalized because they become radicalized later, but religious intellectuals who are trying to constantly apprehend liberalism within an Islamic framework. Some of them are wonderfully productive and I would say instructive in having teased out, elaborated kind of organic, domestic visions of Iranian liberalism in the process. Al-Afghani did both, for instance. Muhammad Ali Foroughi, who was another figure, a prime minister of Iran in the 1940s, in 1920s rather, was another person that I talk in the book. But I think overall, the political projects are completely different. Sharia constitutionalism, however pluralistic, is not liberal constitutionalism. The individual, and this maybe you could say this is the essence of, if there is any essence to liberal project, it is that the individual or equal rights of individuals has to supersede that of any metaphysical or kind of a hierarchical system. But I find those two visions to be in clash with each other.
Thank you, Huss. So we have around 17 minutes left, and a number of people have their hands up. So I think everyone will try to be concise. Bill is next. No, you're done. Okay, cool, Bill. Okay, Simon.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for this wonderful talk. So my experience is that in many important moments of change in these burdened societies, And there are clusters of people whose thought practice are difficult to define, amorphous, and there are, like, probably, as you said, like no conscious programs being built over there, right? And the beauty of these thought practice is precisely that there are many possibilities that are difficult to capture and categorize. Now, in the areas that I'm familiar with, one of such moments would be the beginning of economic marketization in the early early 80s in China, right? And some of the thinkers / activists, they later turned into liberals, and some turned to other ideological doctrines. But at that particular moment, it is not easy for me to say what they are, even when they later self-identify or identify others as liberals or socialists or else. So I guess my question is that does hidden liberal thought practice coexist and merge and interweave with other hidden isms in these kind of rebellious moments? And if so, how do we disentangle them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's an anthropological question because, again, different contexts will present different answers. And I think, from my perspective, as someone who's interested in development of political liberalism or the political movement, I do find the convergence of overlapping or the convergence of differing agendas that nevertheless may have a common enemy at a given point in time, or an obstacle that they wish to remove, is very evident. I mean, you find it all, and what's interesting is that each time in the post-colonial, semi-colonial situation, the liberals come out of those marriages, as it were, marriages of convenience, much more damaged than the other groups. I mean, this is one of the reasons I identify why, that they have not succeeded to really build a program. And the reason for that is simple, is because the ultimate purity test comes down to whether this is something that serves the interests of the nation or the state that is trying to figure out its own, burdened identity at any given time, right? What is Iran? How should it look like in 1950s? What should it look like in after the experience of the Pahlavi monarchy, during the Islamic Republic, etc.? These are all vastly different identities that are constantly presented. And so the liberals come off because they lose. They're ultimately are about a domestic political system that doesn't try to kind of emphasize a particular identity, and maybe that's to their detriment.
Okay, thank you. There are 3 hands up, and that's probably going to take us through. And I'll just, first is Al Mans. I appreciate if each person just try to be as concise as possible.
And I'll be short.
Cool. Go ahead, Al. Al? Alfonso Mans?
Muted.
We don't hear you. Huh. Okay. Maybe you'll return. In the meantime, Kristen Collins can go.
Great, thank you. It strikes me that there's a real contrast between the phenomenon that you're describing as hidden liberalism and something that you want to push back against anyway, but the idea that maybe one of the essential aspects of liberalism is this push for transparency and a transparent society. But to what extent would you think that maybe some of the implications of your work shows that liberalism itself thrives or requires the possibility of concealments to any extent, or that tension?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And in fact, in the late 19th century to early 20th century, the incubators of liberal thinking were secret societies that were modeled after Freemason lodges in Western societies. And some of the liberal thinkers I identify in the late 19th century, early 20th century, come back after their visits in, the European capitals, and they start these secret societies. And there's wonderful books to be written on this subject. I don't have archival access, sadly, to bring this out. But it's one of the ironies that liberal Enlightenment ideas are discussed in secret And I mentioned Faramush Khaneh, the wonderfully titled House of Oblivion, which Malcolm Khan built first. And as its members were even the Qajar Shah of the time. He was a member that they would come in secret and openly talk about, ideas of progress, individuality, creativity, discuss the works of Mill and Montesquieu. I mean, all of this is recorded, and decide who's going to translate them, etc. A lot of imitative work that was going on in that early categories. But it tells you something about how much concealment is in tension with this liberal project for transparency and publicity. You're absolutely right about that. And that's one of the central, I think, points that holds back the development of liberalism.
Thank you. By the way,
Jeff, I'm back. I apologize for not being on when you asked me to, but I'm back. But if I'm able to ask a question.
Yeah, just wait a second.
You're right. Okay.
Please, 1 second. I just wanted to observe that I think some of that dynamic, it was even true of the Enlightenment in France and in England. Don Herzog writes about that. In any case, Al Mans.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. Someone raised the issue about the rule of law, so I'm kind of interested in that, but I think the question may have been answered by the presentation of Huss. And I was just wondering, I mean, in terms of what Jeffrey raised about a theocracy and the whole idea of the rule of law and the constitutionality and the combination of the theocracy and the rule of law and the Constitution, I was just trying to get some understanding of how that really worked. But I think Huss may have answered, at least to give me some thoughts about how it may work. I wonder if anybody might want to comment on that, the significance of their relationship, if they could explain a little bit further.
You want to, by the way, I want to give Jingwei Chen a chance to ask her question, but I see Rahul has his hand up, and maybe he and or Huss wants to answer that question. Then we'll jump to the final question. Maybe go on.
Yeah.
No, I just had a small question for Huss, if there's time.
Oh, there will be time, I promise you. Huss, do you want to answer Al's question? Do you have anything to say?
No, I mean, I think if that distinction that I made between constitutionalism based on rights and rule of law as something that can, very well coexist under an autocratic regime that's not a constitutionally based regime. That distinction is important because you find that, liberal legality and etatist legality or autocratic forms of legality can, exist in many different systems.
Right. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name properly. Jingsu, do I have that right?
Yeah. So I'm a first-year PhD student at Northwestern, and Lubna is actually my advisor. I'm very interested in this topic and comparative political thought. I want to ask the question about illiberalism, because I find illiberalism does only exist in non-Western context, but also actually in a lot of Western countries as well. So I feel there's like a dimension, both a domestic dimension and an international dimension. So I wonder what you think of that. Like I find usually a lot of older generations, they are kind of born into this illiberal mindset. And what should we do about them? Should we persuade them? Do they have a right to be tolerant for their illiberal views? So I want to ask your view on that.
Let me just say that in Professor Jeff Isaac, you have the authority on this subject matter in the Western context, and especially in the American context over the course of the last few years, the last decade or so.
You mean the authority of being an old guy? Go on.
No, and attesting to illiberal tendencies in Western societies.
To be clear, criticizing them, but please go on and answer.
Yeah. No, I think one thing that's very important here in the context of empire and liberalism in non-Western societies is how illiberal liberal Western projects have been in the non-West, and how much that has undercut the development of an open, confident liberal movement in other societies. The reason why there is difficulty for liberalism to emerge from a hidden form of practice to a public one, it's partly because of that stigma. I mean, the stigma of being seen as being one with the liberal Western project that talks nicely, but then carries a very hard and sharp stick, is one that is the most effective way of neutralizing and eliminating liberals in other societies. And I mean, it's very, in a contemporary setting, I mean, you only have to look at Hong Kong and, Belarus and, other examples to really appreciate just how effective this is at taking out people who have this dual burden, as we talked about in their countries.
Does that answer your question, Jingsu?
No.
Jeff clearly doesn't think so.
No, I just want to make, I like her, and she's visiting from Northwestern with Lubna, so I want to make sure she gets proper satisfaction. I'm fine with your answer. I want to know if she is.
I know. I appreciate you.
I'm assuming you are, so okay, we'll treat that as tacit consent. Rahul has something to say, and then I'm going to call on Bill Scheuerman, but Rahul.
Okay, just a quick clarification, Huss. If you could say something about this. So when I was talking about the burden that Islam places on liberals who then can't come out as liberals, the issue there is not so much that whether Islam is compatible with liberalism or not, or the ways in which the religious authorities conveniently create an insurmountable divide. That's not the issue. The issue really, I think, that makes liberals have to hide themselves is religiosity or the incomplete secularization of these societies. If you live in a society in which people strongly believe in a certain set of religious principles, certain things shouldn't be eaten or drunk, or certain premarital sex is not okay, etc., then as a liberal, you do need to speak quietly and indirectly. It's not about the religion, it's about the religiosity that places a very strong, when you think about India or other places, there is a multiplication and a plurality of religious authorities, which means no one's very dominant. But in a system in which many people believe in the religion and it has a strong hierarchical structure where someone can give authoritative diktats, that makes it much harder to be a liberal, because you can in fact be targeted and you can be punished. So that was whether you think that burden sociologically is higher and produces more of a hidden liberalism in the Islamic world. It's not about the religion itself.
No, that's wonderful, and thank you for clarifying that. I guess in the case of Iran, because of the sharp contrast between the Pahlavi years and after the Islamic Revolution, it gives us a very good experimental kind of ground to look at when you have a monarch that insists on hard secularization policies, and Turkey is another good lab for looking into these questions, and then you have a system that requires women to, as we say in Iran, women went from being beaten for wearing the hijab to now being beaten and imprisoned for not wearing the hijab, right? When you have that experiment in the course of 50 years or so, it reveals a great deal about how religiosity and what the spectrum looks like and what are the obstacles. And I think what I found in Iran is not so much that really it is an obstacle. There's no question that level of religiosity in the social and cultural fabric of society can be a restraint. But as we see in very religious communities in the United States and elsewhere, where Christian fundamentalism is rampant, et cetera, the broader context in which you exist in that way, if, in other words, the constitutional architecture is based on liberal legality and on rights, it makes a big difference. And the coexistence becomes just that. You can identify the religious zealot from the liberal zealot, right? And point at them in that respective way. And in fact, I think that's the space that does not exist, that I think hidden liberalism is ultimately emerged out of, as opposed to these kind of much more social, cultural based practices.
Thank you, Huss. By the way, so we have formally 2 more minutes, but people have to leave at 1:30, they should, but I want to hold this a little bit longer because there's a really interesting issue that I think is a kind of very serious political theory issue that's being raised in chat. I always find it difficult. Actually, chat eludes me. I don't like chat on Zoom. But in any case, Bill Scheuerman, true to form, is accusing at least 2 of the 3 panelists of being legal positivists, I see.
Not an accusation. I
know. Okay, look.
No,
maybe briefly explain, and then they could respond, because Lubna's a little concerned, and I don't understand why she's a legal positivist, but why don't you explain?
Yeah. All right. So, Lubna, I took you to be saying the rule of law is this pretty open-ended, pretty open concept, culturally, in terms of its substance, right? You can talk about it in different settings. It's integrally related to the modern state. That's crucial. And Huss, a moment ago, I thought you sort of agreed with this. I mean, basically, legal positivists say we should understand the rule of law in a very open-ended way. So a very famous legal positivist, a guy by the name of Hans Kelsen, said, Stalin, there's the rule of law. Hitler, the rule of law, right? Now, of course, that is not, an uncontroversial view of the rule of law. There are liberals who say, radical Democrats, conservatives, natural lawyers who say, no, it has to have some sort of normative content, right? So that it's just a definitional little point, I guess. But I guess I've been thinking how this relates to your book, okay? And it seemed to me you're also talking about constitutionalism potentially, right? Is taking very many different forms. Now you want to say there's hidden liberalism, and I guess you want to say that Iranian constitutional traditions, I have to remember this, I read the earlier version, right? But they had some sort of proto-liberal quality. So my question to you would be, I mean, how would we distinguish the makings, let's say, of liberal constitutionalism from what people nowadays are calling authoritarian constitutionalism? There's a whole debate about authoritarian legalism, right? Authoritarian constitutionalism. You can have, a legal system that's authoritarian. 19th century Prussia, maybe Singapore, right? A constitutional system, Hungary, right? Is constitutional system, Russia. It's not, they haven't thrown the Constitution out the window. So how, I forget how you do this. Maybe you do go ahead and make an argument about this, but why not describe some of these things that you're pointing to in Iran as, as kind of a legalist / constitutionalist tradition, which doesn't necessarily have a liberal substance.
Very good.
Some sort of liberal substance, broadly defined.
Lubna, would you like to go first?
I'm just thinking about what, yeah. I guess the point is that I was trying to make, though I see the issue, is that the justification for any form of law, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, what was the example you mentioned, the Nazi regime? I mean, that's not, so there's a rule of law, and what I mean by it is a rule of law that's justified on an equal basis to all the citizens who belong to the community. So that would not fall under this. So I am building in some normative content. But by my idea, though, my thought is that normative context, no society will accept that missing part, that you cannot justify. Now some states will try to justify in this language and do something else, but they would have to justify it in the language of it being acceptable to all the citizens. And that's the trick that I think, so that idea that it has to be acceptable to all the citizens equally is sort of, it seems to me, sort of a necessary feature of the way we sort of modern states are run. So that just adds a subtle more normative element, but I think that's kind of almost necessitated by the structure.
But Lubna, isn't that, I mean, we're out of time. That's very normative. That sounds to me like democratic legitimacy on some level, right? I mean, maybe not modern representative democracy, but you're moving in that direction. So that's a very normative, and then you're not going to have.
Is that liberal?
Okay, all right.
Are you, Lubna, are you saying that any state that doesn't have that normativity cannot function as a state in the modern world?
Legal order.
It would not be accepted. It has to speak that language. Now, it doesn't actually act like that way because it's allowed to do other things. But no state goes around saying, actually, half of the citizens can, die, and then it doesn't say it this way. Right? And so there's a need to speak a certain language and to sell sell yourself as doing something. And I think that's crucial.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if I can piggyback on this point, I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran says the reason why you don't need liberal democracy is because we guarantee even a more substantive set of rights than liberalism gives you, right? And they mix and match a critique of kind of, you know, liberal reason and liberal rights borrowed from, you know, Marxist criticisms with Islamic criticisms of, you know, the individualism of liberalism and the, you know, the importance of preservation of community, et cetera. And as we've discussed in many of these gatherings, you know, people like Patrick Deneen, et cetera, are, you know, trying to also present those critiques of liberalism in the American or Western liberal context as well. To your point, which I'm grateful for. I should say, by the way, I know some people have left, but this book benefited tremendously from a workshop that we held at IU, and both Jeff and, Jeff Aurelian and Bill made invaluable contributions. And Bill, you raised this very point and when I presented it, and it wasn't there, but oh
my God.
No, but I'm grateful for you raising it again, because I was so conscious of accounting for this oversight. So the way I do it is by first, and this was the point that you raised, which is that if you look at the development of constitutionalism in the West, there's a story to be told. It is not this kind of overnight, you know, appearance of a universal set of, you know, rights and architecture, et cetera. And you need to bring that story out, which I hope I've done in this version. So you say constitutionalism in the context of late 19th century, these people call themselves liberals, and these are the aims that they had. Now, whether that got realized, it obviously didn't, it went away. And then constitutionalism, because it sounded good, and this goes to Lubna's point, became the normative, the acceptable, appropriate way for a state to behave. And so even Reza Khan, you know, the absolutist monarch, would absolutely bow before the Constitution and say, you know, in the image of, or, you know, as he wished to copy Ataturk's kind of project in Turkey in the same way, that this was about the advancement of the nation. The Constitution as a kind of a progressive document is very important, et cetera. But also, I think, talking about constitutional historically is one way of dealing with this and not getting bogged down in this kind of abstract discussion. But I think as you play the tape forward, as it were, the normative content that liberals would like to see be ever present in the concept of constitutionalism that they wish to advance as a prescription becomes, you know, a lot more clear. And that's the battle line right now. The people who are getting exiled, who find themselves in Western academies like me, or, you know, have been driven out of the country or are jailed, those are the people who would like these things, these normative precepts, to be elaborated and then enshrined into law for that kind of liberal constitutional vision to come to fruition.
Thank you, Huss. So I feel a little bit bad because someone hasn't gotten to ask a question. On the other hand, we're like over, and I see even Aurelian's left. And I think that there's a virtue to moderating ourselves to the extent of trying to stay within Aurelian's limits, at least with regard to the events he organizes. So with apologies to Cherry B, who I don't know, and I wish you all the best.
Oh, my name is Barbara, by the way. Hi, how are you? I'm a less frequent observer, kind of an outsider coming in, and I just had a brief comment. But
and my colleague on the BFC and the Bloomington Faculty Council.
Well, Huss, I defer, I guess, to you. Do you want to hear Barbara's brief comment, or should we just break it now?
Only because I believe Barbara brings serious legal expertise into this conversation. So please.
Okay, and because I am not a legal positivist, I feel some natural sense to allow her to speak, some natural sympathy or something. I don't know. Go on.
Jeff, you're a reactionary natural lawyer.
Hey, but I'm also PhD in social science, so I'm a hybrid. Yes, I love these opportunities to listen to people from interdisciplinary perspective. And an observation with Isaac's pessimism. In any given academic forum, there can be a certain insularity that can block receptivity, different ways of thinking. What I benefit from, and a lot of people benefit from, is listening to discussions across across different disciplines. What strikes me here today, just I could share with you, is how you even use the term rule of law has different meanings depending upon the discipline you're in. Rule of law, at least among legal scholars and people studying governance, is an emergent property of certain societies. You cannot guarantee them de jure. You can put some de jure rules in place, but what makes rule of law exist is de facto. So when you say rule of law exists in an area, it's because de facto it's actually lived there. And that's an important distinction that lawyers make between when something exists de jure as a matter of law versus when they exist in practice.
So
and so if you want to talk across disciplines, I was just suggesting, this is what I found doing interdisciplinary work. Keywords mean different things to different disciplines. So if you want to talk to people across disciplines, you have to understand the different meanings that these words have. And therefore, if you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges.
Thank you. Thank you for that observation. By the way, before I close, I would just also like to observe that disciplines don't speak with a single voice.
Oh, no, I know, but there's a tendency within.
Yes, thank you.
That's all
I think the range of opinions that we've been exposed to today from people within the political science discipline and more broadly has been really interesting. And I want to thank everyone, every single person who's participated for their participation. Thank Huss for his book. Thank our guests, Rahul and Lubna, for their wonderful participation. And again, everyone who's spoken here, and also Aurelian, I'd like to pay a little tribute to him. I often tease him, but he's a very close friend and colleague. And I know we all share condolences for him, this week. And we're sorry he couldn't be more present, but we appreciate everything he's done. So thank you very much. We're going to end this thing now. I wish you all well. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rahul.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Huss. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.